My hand was in the photograph, but the rest of me had been carefully severed with a razor blade. Just 4 pale fingers resting on my younger sister's shoulder, framed in silver and displayed next to the wedding cake. I stood in the entry hall of the renovated Gastonia textile mill, holding the thick paper envelope that had brought me here. The sharp edge of the invitation dug into my thumb. It was addressed simply to Corinne Hayes, with no family title and no mention that the bride was my sister. The scent of white gardenias mixed with the metallic tang of old machine oil, heavy and sweet in the cool April air. My heels clicked against the polished concrete floor, a slow and steady rhythm that echoed beneath the string quartet playing in the main room. I was 39 years old, a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army Corps of Engineers, and I had just walked into a building where my family had spent 11 years pretending I was dead. I checked my phone before walking through the double doors. There was a missed call from Naomi, my civil attorney, along with a short text message. The lender counsel asked me to verify a new submission bearing your name, the text read. Do not discuss the file without me. I locked the screen and slid the device into my coat pocket. A new submission. They had actually done it. I stepped into the main ballroom. Guests milled around tables, draped in white linen, sipping champagne and waiting for the ceremony to begin. My mother found me first. Elaine wore a pale blue dress that matched her practiced smile, and she pulled me into a tight embrace before anyone else could notice the tension between us. Her perfume was suffocating. Please do not embarrass your sister, she whispered, her voice tight against my ear. She pulled back and smoothed my collar, playing the perfect host for the watching crowd. My father stood 2 steps behind her. Martin did not offer a hug, nor did he extend a hand. He let his eyes travel over my simple navy dress, his jaw set hard. Can you behave for one afternoon? He asked. I did not answer him. I simply looked past his shoulder toward the photo display, noting my complete absence from our shared history. They had erased me, but they still needed my name. A ripple of laughter drew my attention to the bridal suite door. Jenna emerged in a cloud of white silk and lace, surrounded by her bridesmaids. She stopped when she saw me, feigning a perfect gasp of surprise. Her smile sharpened into something cruel as she closed the distance between us. You actually came, she said loudly, ensuring the closest guests could hear, and you are still just a soldier? The question hung in the air, heavy with 11 years of manufactured resentment. She wanted me to shrink. She wanted me to react like the disgraced daughter who had abandoned the family business. I kept my voice perfectly level. I left after I refused to sign something that was not true. Jenna threw her head back and laughed. That is the oldest excuse in the family, she declared, waving a manicured hand dismissively. The commotion had attracted the groom. A tall man with a calm demeanor stepped out from the crowd, placing a hand on Jenna's waist. He looked at me, and I watched the polite confusion on his face evaporate into sudden, sharp recognition. The relaxed posture vanished. His spine snapped straight, his shoulders squared, and his chin tucked in a reflexive military stance. He stood at attention right there in the ballroom. Colonel Hayes, he said. The string quartet seemed to fade into background noise. Daniel Mercer was a reserve captain. He had served under my command during a disaster recovery mission 2 years ago, a man who understood accountability and strict adherence to protocol. The blood drained from his face as he looked from me to the woman in the white dress. I didn't know she was your sister, he said, his voice dropping to a hollow whisper. Jenna dropped her champagne flute. The delicate crystal shattered against the polished concrete, sending pale gold liquid splashing across the toes of her satin shoes. Security, my father barked, stepping forward with his face flushed dark red. She is using her rank to ruin this wedding. Escort her out. I did not look at Martin. I did not mention my rank, and I did not raise my voice. I kept my eyes locked on Daniel, knowing exactly what kind of man he was. Before I leave, I said, maintaining that steady gaze, Ask Jenna why her company submitted a document bearing my signature 3 weeks after my attorney told her it was not authorized. Panic flared in Jenna's eyes. She reacted on pure instinct, desperate to keep the narrative intact. That signature kept this family alive, she snapped. The silence that followed was absolute. Daniel slowly pulled his hand away from her waist. He looked at his bride as if she were a stranger holding a weapon. "You submitted it after she denied it?" he asked. Jenna spun toward our father, her perfect facade crumbling. "You said she would never come back," she pleaded. I turned and walked toward the exit, before the security guards could even cross the room. The heavy wooden doors swung shut behind me, muting the sudden chaos erupting in the ballroom. As I walked down the long corridor toward the parking lot, Daniel's voice echoed through the wood, demanding that everyone clear the bridal suite so he could speak to his fiancée in private. The clicking of my heels was joined by the frantic slap of footsteps behind me. My mother grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my coat sleeve. "You ruined this," Elaine hissed, her eyes wild with anger. "You ruined her day." I gently removed her hand from my arm. I asked one question. Jenna answered it. I pushed the heavy exit door open and stepped out into the cool spring air. The morning rain had left the pavement slick, reflecting the gray clouds overhead. When I reached my car, my phone rang. It was Naomi. I picked up on the first ring. "The lender counsel just paused the file review," my attorney said, her voice crisp and professional over the speaker. "They need you to sign an affidavit swearing you did not authorize that document. They would not tell me who uploaded it or share the internal logs, but they are terrified." "Prepare the affidavit," I told her. "I will sign it tonight." I ended the call and opened the car door. The phone buzzed again, vibrating against my palm. An unknown number flashed on the screen, but I recognized the area code. I hit the green button and lifted the receiver to my ear. "Colonel," Daniel's voice came through the line, tight and ragged. "Jenna told me she was an only child." He paused, taking a sharp breath. "And tomorrow morning, I was supposed to sign papers backing that loan." The memory of that signature had haunted me for over a decade. Standing in the damp parking lot of the Gastonia Mill, listening to Daniel Mercer realize he was about to underwrite a massive financial fraud, the cool spring air felt exactly like the morning it all began. My mind pulled me backward, away from the wedding music and the shattered champagne glass, returning to April 2014. I was 28 years old, working as the lead structural engineer and safety manager for Blake Infrastructure. The wind sweeping off the Carolina foothills that morning carried the heavy scent of diesel exhaust and wet clay. Dawn had not yet broken over the massive commercial site. I stood beneath the towering steel frame of crane 4412, sweeping the bright beam of my heavy flashlight along the primary load-bearing assembly. Site supervisor Walter Pike stood beside me, his thick jacket zipped to his chin, his breath pluming in the freezing air. The enormous machine had been making an uneven, rhythmic grinding noise during the previous shift, and Walter had called me before the morning crew arrived. My light caught the fatal flaw. A hairline fracture spider-webbed across the main joint housing, barely visible beneath a layer of industrial grease. Walter saw the jagged line at the same moment and cursed softly under his breath. We both knew exactly what it meant. I pulled the heavy metal clipboard from his hands, clicked my pen, and filled out Stop Work Directive 17C. I signed my name at the bottom of the yellow carbon paper in bright blue ink. The equipment was officially grounded. 10 hours later, the mahogany walls of my father's office seemed to vibrate with his shouting. Martin Blake did not care about hairline fractures or joint integrity. He paced behind his massive executive desk, waving a thick stack of delay penalty clauses in the air, his face flushed with rage. Grounding the crane would cost us the municipal contract, he insisted, and put hundreds of loyal men out of work. I sat in one of the leather guest chairs, keeping my posture rigid and my voice steady. I explained that catastrophic structural failure would cost lives, and safety regulations were not optional guidelines. My mother sat on the velvet sofa in the corner, calmly polishing her reading glasses. Elaine sighed loudly, pointing out that my younger sister Jenna had canceled a weekend beach trip just to help the accounting department balance the quarterly books. The woman who raised me accused me of treating the family business like a sterile laboratory, always putting government rules ahead of family loyalty. I refused to lift the directive. The crane had to stay grounded until the vendor replaced the broken assembly. 2 days later, I arrived at the main office, dressed in a dark navy suit. I had a final interview scheduled for my direct commission into the Army Corps of Engineers, a career backup plan my parents had mocked for months. As I gathered my portfolio from my desk, my cell phone rang. It was Walter. The site supervisor sounded frantic, shouting over the roar of heavy diesel engines in the background. My father had driven to the construction site and invoked an owner override, authorizing a temporary restart based on a verbal assurance from the equipment vendor. Martin had ordered the crew to begin the heaviest steel lift of the entire week. I told Walter I was formally distancing myself from the override, and I immediately drafted an email to our outside corporate counsel to document my severe objection. My hands were shaking with pure anger as I hit send. Before leaving for my military interview, I needed to clear my outbox. I quickly signed a standard draft cover sheet acknowledging receipt of a vendor safety manual, intending to file the packet later that afternoon. I left the paper, bearing my authentic blue ink signature, sitting on top of my desk organizer. Jenna was standing by the copy machine across the room. My sister watched me sign the paper in complete silence. I assumed she was just keeping her head down to avoid our father's temper. I would learn much later how observant the young office administrator truly was. The disaster happened that afternoon while I was sitting in a military recruiter office. A massive steel beam slipped when the fractured housing finally gave way under the immense load. The terrifying screech of tearing metal echoed across the county line. The emergency room waiting area smelled of industrial bleach and stale vending machine coffee. I found Ruth Delgado sitting on a plastic chair in the corner, clutching a torn leather work glove against her chest. Her husband, Miguel, had been crushed instantly. 2 other men were currently in surgery. I sat beside Ruth and held her trembling hand, completely unable to speak around the sharp knot in my throat. Martin arrived an hour later, flanked by corporate lawyers. The founder of Blake Infrastructure did not offer any condolences to the weeping widow. He pulled me into a vacant hospital hallway and instructed me to coordinate a unified story for the insurance adjusters. When I demanded to see the site packet to prove the equipment had been officially red flagged, my father simply looked away. Stop Work Directive 17C had vanished from the clipboard. The true betrayal took place the following morning in the company boardroom. A thick document sat in the exact center of the polished conference table. The final equipment clearance summary concluded that the crane had been perfectly maintained and blamed the fatal collapse entirely on operator error. They were blaming Miguel Delgado for his own death. Martin pushed a silver pen across the wood, demanding that I sign the approval line to calm the bonding company and save the business from immediate bankruptcy. I stared at the absolute lie printed on the crisp white paper. I pushed the pen back across the table, opened my laptop, and typed a second email to our outside counsel. I explicitly stated that I had not and would never approve the final clearance report. Jenna walked into the boardroom carrying a tray of fresh coffee. She offered me a cup with wide, sympathetic eyes, playing the role of the supportive younger sibling to perfection. She whispered that she understood how hard our father was pushing me, gently patting my shoulder. Then, my sister gestured toward the stack of routine paperwork on the corner of the table, asking if she could take my drafts to make copies for the archive. I handed her the entire pile, including the cover sheet bearing my authentic signature. Providing her with that clean signature page was the most devastating mistake of my career. My refusal to sign the fake report triggered a swift family execution. Martin delivered his ultimatum right there in the boardroom. I had to sign a family responsibility statement accepting blame for the project delay, withdraw my military application, and stay to manage the public relations fallout. If I walked out that door, I was no longer a Blake. Elaine wept openly, burying her perfectly made-up face in her hands. My mother wailed that I was choosing a uniform over my own blood, actively trying to destroy the legacy my father had built from nothing. I did not argue with them. I did not raise my voice or beg for understanding. I simply reached into my leather purse and placed my corporate credit card on the mahogany table. I added my office keys, my site access badge, and the keys to the company truck. I packed my personal documents, ensuring I had physical copies of my objection emails to the attorneys, and walked out of the building. By sunset, I had packed 2 suitcases from my apartment. Martin sent a final text message declaring that Jenna was now his only child. I did not ask for severance, I did not ask for a loan, and I drove away without looking back. I spent the next 3 years learning how to build a life out of the complete wreckage. By the summer of 2017, I was living in a modest apartment near my assigned military base. The Army provided a brutal, cleansing structure that kept me moving forward. I focused entirely on engineering, on disaster response protocols, on keeping innocent people alive when civil infrastructure failed. I paid my own bills, bought my own groceries, and survived the exile on my own terms. Then the mail arrived on a humid Tuesday afternoon. A thick manila envelope sat in my metal mailbox, bearing a return address from Ruth Delgado. I carried it upstairs, the heavy paper sticking to my fingers in the oppressive Carolina heat. I sat at my small kitchen table, sliced the flap open with a butter knife, and pulled out a single stack of stapled papers. It was a photocopy of the final equipment clearance summary, retrieved from the insurance archive. It was the exact same report I had refused to approve in the boardroom 3 years earlier. The document that falsely blamed Miguel Delgado for the catastrophic crane collapse. I turned to the final page, my heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. There, sitting perfectly at the bottom of the printed text, was an exact reproduction of my handwriting. Someone had stolen my name. I stared at the curved blue letters, feeling the cold reality settle deep into my bones. The family had not exiled me because I was a failure or because I had betrayed their trust. They had forced me out so they could control the narrative without my constant interference. Jenna had taken the clean signature from my draft stack, grafted it onto the fraudulent report, and Martin had submitted it to the insurance adjusters while I was busy packing my bags. I did not call my parents to scream or demand an apology. I did not drive back to Charlotte to confront Jenna. I picked up my phone, scrolled through my contacts, and dialed the number for Naomi Price, a ruthless civil attorney recommended by a fellow engineering officer. The time for arguing with my family was officially over. It was time to start building a fortress. The morning after Ruth Delgado's envelope arrived, the North Carolina heat was already radiating off the pavement outside Naomi Price's office window. The civil attorney specialized in commercial fraud, and she did not offer false comfort or empty promises. Naomi spread the photocopied final equipment clearance summary flat on her expansive mahogany desk. Her manicured fingers tapped the forged signature with the end of her silver pen, her expression completely unreadable as she studied the blue ink. A photocopy proved that someone had manipulated the record, she explained in a calm, measured voice. However, without the original file or a digital trail showing exactly who had uploaded it to the insurance portal, filing a civil lawsuit would simply give my family the warning they needed to destroy the remaining evidence. Naomi leaned back in her leather chair, steepling her fingers together. The statute of limitations on the original fraud had grown complicated. she noted, especially since the company had buried the paperwork deep inside a closed insurance file. We had to lock the truth in place before they realized we were watching their movements, ensuring that any future use of the document would constitute a brand new, prosecutable offense. Naomi drafted a formal affidavit right there in the office. I raised my right hand, swore the oath, and pressed my pen to the crisp legal paper, signing a sworn statement declaring that I had never approved the clearance report. Signing that document felt like pulling a heavy iron door shut on the life I had left behind 3 years earlier. Following my sudden departure in 2014, my mother had made one final, desperate attempt to bring me to heel. Elaine had mailed a cashier's check for $50,000 to my tiny off-base apartment, tucking the bank draft inside a pale pink greeting card. The handwritten note dictated that the money would clear my account the moment I signed a formal apology to Jenna and acknowledged that my father had acted responsibly on the job site. The heavy paper smelled exactly like her expensive gardenia perfume, bringing a sudden, sharp wave of nausea to my stomach. I stood at my tiny kitchen counter for a long time, staring at the zeros printed across the bank draft. $50,000 would have paid off my student loans and secured my rent for years. It was the exact price they had placed on my silence and my dignity. I did not cash the check, and I did not call home to argue. Instead, I drove straight to a local shipping center, photocopied the entire package for my own records, and mailed the original draft back to her via certified mail. That same afternoon, I removed Martin and Elaine as my emergency contacts and opened an independent retirement account with my first military paycheck. Earning my rank required more than simply wearing the uniform and following orders. The Army Corps of Engineers demanded absolute precision, and my early assignments tested every physical and mental limit I possessed. During my first command briefing, I failed spectacularly in front of a room full of senior officers. I recited safety protocols like a machine, my voice flat and unyielding, alienating the veteran engineers because I treated the rulebook as more important than the people executing the work. My commanding officer pulled me aside afterward. He bluntly informed me that using rigid perfectionism as a shield was a terrible leadership strategy, and I had to learn how to trust human beings to do the heavy lifting. Over the next 7 years, I deployed to multiple disaster zones across the southeastern coastline. We rebuilt shattered bridges in blinding rain, stabilized power grids while knee-deep in toxic floodwater, and slept on canvas cots in freezing gymnasiums. The mud, the deafening roar of industrial generators, and the sheer physical exhaustion stripped away the last lingering expectations of my wealthy childhood. That grueling environment was where a young reserve captain named Daniel Mercer first served under my command. A massive storm surge had compromised a critical supply bridge, and my team had been working for 36 straight hours to stabilize the concrete pillars. Daniel had miscalculated a load distribution on the secondary support beams, a mistake that could have buckled the entire structure. I pulled him off the line, showed him the mathematical error, and forced him to personally lead the reinforcement crew until the bridge was safe. He took the correction without a single excuse, earning my permanent respect in the process. My promotions came steadily after that deployment, built on a solid foundation of documented successes and quiet competence, rather than my father's checkbook. By my mid-30s, I had saved enough money to purchase a modest brick townhouse on a quiet street, far from the sprawling manicured lawns of Charlotte. I sat at the closing table entirely alone, reading every single clause before signing the 30-year mortgage. There was no family trust fund waiting in the background, no wealthy guarantor co-signing the loan, and no safety net if I failed to make the monthly payments. The empty living room smelled of fresh paint and aged pine floorboards, and the brass keys felt incredibly heavy in my palm. I walked through the quiet rooms, listening to my boots echo against the hardwood, knowing that every square inch of the property belonged entirely to me. The very first item I moved into the new house was a heavy, fireproof safe. I positioned it in the corner of my home office, bolting it directly to the floorboards, and filled it with my most critical possessions. The thick blue folder inside contained the original certified mail receipt from the return check, my mother's pink greeting card, printouts of my urgent emails to the outside counsel, and a detailed timeline log written in my own hand. I called it the Blue File. It was not a revenge fantasy, and I absolutely refused to obsess over it every day. It was simply an insurance policy for a fire I hoped would never actually burn. Armed with my sworn affidavit, Naomi sent a formal preservation notice to Blake Infrastructure, their insurance provider, and their outside corporate counsel. The registered legal document demanded that they retain all original versions, digital backups, server logs, and metadata related to the Miguel Delgado accident. The response came less than 48 hours later. My phone buzzed against the granite kitchen counter while I was unpacking a cardboard box of plates. The caller ID displayed my father's private office line, a number I had not seen in 3 years. I let the call go to voicemail, watching the red recording icon pulse steadily on the illuminated screen. When I finally pressed play, Martin's voice filled the quiet kitchen, loud and aggressive. He accused me of trying to extort the family out of petty jealousy, his tone thick with a practiced, righteous indignation. He demanded to know exactly how much money I wanted to drop the legal threats, promising to ruin my military career by calling my commanding officers if I contacted his insurance company again. The blatant intimidation tactic was so familiar, so perfectly Martin Blake, that it almost made me laugh. I did not call him back, and my hands did not shake. Instead, I forwarded the audio file directly to Naomi, along with a short text message. Preserving corporate records is not an accusation, I typed into the phone. Deleting them would be. Following the preservation notice, the Blake family cut all remaining ties. The sudden, total silence stretching across the years felt jarring at first, leaving a strange ringing in my ears. But it slowly transformed into genuine peace. I learned how to construct a daily life that did not revolve around waiting for an apology that would never come. I hosted chaotic Thanksgiving dinners at my townhouse, filling the small dining room with fellow engineering officers, older neighborhood friends who treated me like a daughter, and a loud group of volunteer mechanics I worked with on weekends. We drank cheap red wine from mismatched glasses, laughed until our sides physically ached, and never once discussed the commercial construction business. Whenever someone asked about my family, I simply told them my parents had passed away. It was easier than explaining the truth, and in many ways it felt accurate. I aggressively paid down my mortgage principal, padding my savings account with every promotion. I strictly refused to look at Jenna's social media profiles, blocking her accounts to prevent even accidental glimpses into her curated world. Naomi checked the public court dockets and regional insurance filings every 6 months, searching for any sign that the fraudulent clearance report had been utilized in a new financial transaction. Year after year, the methodical search came up completely empty. Eventually, I accepted the quiet reality that the blue file might remain locked inside the metal safe forever. The family had stolen my signature, but they had not managed to take my future. The turning point arrived exactly 11 years after my father forced me out of his corporate boardroom. The autumn air had just turned sharp and crisp in late October of 2024. I was sitting at my kitchen table, nursing a hot cup of black coffee while reviewing a complex set of bridge load schematics. My personal laptop chimed softly, signaling a new message in my private inbox. I glanced at the bright screen and froze, the ceramic mug stopping halfway to my mouth. The sender name read, Jenna Blake. I opened the message, my eyes scanning the brief, overly cheerful text. She enthusiastically announced she was getting married the following spring, claiming she desperately wanted her only sister standing by her side for the ceremony. We should finally put the past behind us, Jenna wrote. Her words dripped with a manufactured, sugary warmth that made the muscles in my neck immediately tighten. The ornate wedding invitation was attached as a separate file, but the final sentence of the email caught my complete attention, causing a cold prickle of awareness to wash over my skin. "I just need one small signature first," the message concluded. I set my coffee mug down very carefully, making sure the ceramic did not clatter against the wood. The blue file in my office safe had been waiting for 11 years. Jenna had just given me the key to open it. The email from Jenna contained 2 separate attachments. The first was a glossy, professionally designed wedding invitation filled with flowing cursive fonts and floral borders. But the second file was a bland, 2-page portable document format titled Historical Acknowledgement. I clicked the small icon, scanning the dense legal text while my morning coffee grew cold on the counter. My sister framed the document as a simple clerical formality, a minor piece of housekeeping needed to close out an old corporate audit. That innocent framing vanished when I reached the second paragraph of the appendix. Buried in the fine print was a specific reference to a commercial lender due diligence review directly attached to the final equipment clearance summary from 11 years ago. They were trying to secure a massive new expansion loan, and the underwriting department clearly wanted my signature verified before releasing the funds. I did not reply to Jenna, nor did I pick up the phone to scream at my father. I simply forwarded the entire email chain to Naomi Price. The civil attorney moved with clinical, devastating precision. Within 48 hours, Naomi drafted a formal letter of denial and dispatched it to Blake Infrastructure via certified mail. The legal document explicitly stated that I had never signed or approved the final clearance report, demanding they immediately cease using my name in any commercial capacity. She also copied the legal department of the commercial lender, using the direct contact information conveniently listed in Jenna's own attachment. The backlash arrived exactly on schedule. My phone rang late on a Thursday evening, the bright screen displaying Martin's private office number. I answered the call, letting the silence stretch across the line until he finally spoke. My father did not bother with a greeting or ask how I had been living for the past decade. He launched straight into a practiced, booming speech about payrolls and heavy obligations, claiming this new loan would save hundreds of working-class families from losing their livelihoods. "You are being entirely unreasonable over a piece of useless paper," Martin insisted, his voice thick with manufactured disappointment. "You are willing to put my men on the street just to prove a point." "Saving jobs does not give you the right to steal my name," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level. I ended the call and permanently blocked the number. 2 weeks later, a thick cream envelope appeared in my townhouse mailbox. Elaine had bypassed the electronic route entirely, sending a formal wedding invitation pressed on heavy cardstock. A handwritten note slipped out of the centerfold, the paper smelling faintly of her signature gardenia perfume. My mother promised that nobody would ask me to sign anything at the ceremony, insisting that Jenna genuinely wanted to heal the bitter family rift before walking down the aisle. I called my mother that evening, breaking 11 years of total silence. Elaine answered on the first ring, immediately weeping softly into the receiver and calling me by my childhood nickname. I let her cry for a moment before asking the only question that mattered. "Does Daniel know I exist?" I asked, cutting cleanly through her tears. The line went dead quiet. My mother cleared her throat, her voice suddenly tight and deeply defensive. She told me the past had no place in a new marriage, arguing that bringing up old grievances would only confuse the groom on his special day. That clumsy evasion was a complete answer. They had hidden my existence from Daniel Mercer, and they needed my physical presence at the wedding to legitimize the lie. While my family tried to manipulate my schedule, Naomi was quietly hunting through the past. She had spent weeks combing through the archive of emails I sent on the morning of the crane accident, finally tracking down the old site supervisor, Walter Pike. Walter had passed away 3 years ago, but his son agreed to meet us at Naomi's downtown office on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Evan Pike carried a battered cardboard box into the conference room, setting it heavily on the polished mahogany table. He reached inside and pulled out a faded yellow sheet of carbon paper, sliding it carefully across the wood. It was the original physical copy of Stop Work Directive 17C. The serial number for Crane 4412 was clearly legible, sitting right above my authentic signature in blue ink. The fragile paper smelled faintly of old motor oil and damp basement air. "My dad kept this hidden in his garage for a decade," Evan said quietly, staring at his hands. "He told me Miss Blake was the only person who tried to stop that lift. He never forgave himself for letting your father turn the machine back on." Naomi carefully placed the yellow carbon sheet inside a clear plastic evidence sleeve, her eyes meeting mine across the table. We finally possessed an independent physical anchor, a piece of irrefutable evidence proving I had shut the site down before Miguel Delgado died. As the wedding date approached in April 2025, I prepared my life for a potential blast wave. I checked the security cameras mounted outside my townhouse, verifying the footage automatically uploaded to an external server. I carried the original blue file, along with Evan's carbon copy, to a secure bank vault and handed Naomi a notarized inventory of every single document. At the military base, I formally requested a closed-door meeting with my commanding officer. I disclosed that I was currently involved in a civil family dispute regarding a commercial fraud investigation. I provided documentation proving I was handling the matter entirely through private civilian attorneys, ensuring no military resources, personnel, or titles would ever be leveraged in the fight. My commander simply nodded, noting the absolute transparency in my personnel file, and advised me to keep a safe distance from the blast radius. I chose a simple navy dress for the ceremony, deliberately leaving my uniform and any military insignia locked in my closet. I established strict personal boundaries for the afternoon. I would not engage in private arguments in secluded rooms, I would not accept any open beverages, and I would absolutely not sign a single piece of paper. If anyone threatened me or called security, I would walk away without a fight. I was not attending the wedding to cause a public scene. I was going to see if my family had actually stopped using the fraudulent document. The morning of April 12th brought a light, misty rain to the Carolina foothills. I drove my sedan down the winding rural highway toward the renovated Gastonia textile mill, watching the windshield wipers drag back and forth in a hypnotic, steady rhythm. 30 minutes from the venue, my cell phone chimed with a new voicemail alert. I pulled the car onto the gravel shoulder and pressed play. Naomi's voice filled the quiet cabin, crisp and brutally urgent. "The lender counsel just contacted me," my attorney said, her words rushing together. "They received a new submission bearing your name late yesterday afternoon. The bank would not disclose the portal access logs or tell me who actually uploaded the file, but they are requesting an immediate verification affidavit. Do not argue technical details with anyone today. Just walk away if they push you." I sat in the idling car, listening to the rain tap aggressively against the glass. Jenna and Martin had received my formal legal denial, and they had submitted the forged clearance report anyway. They were betting their entire future on the assumption that I would quietly comply to avoid ruining a beautiful wedding. I turned off my phone, dropped the device into my coat pocket, and shifted the car back into drive. I decided I would only ask one question when I walked through those heavy wooden doors. Just one simple question to test exactly what Jenna knew about the bank submission. When I finally stepped into the grand entry hall of the venue, the string quartet was already playing a soft classical melody. I paused near the welcome table to drop off my coat, my eyes scanning the busy room. Beyond the guest book, sitting discreetly beneath the elaborate floral seating chart on the family reserve table, was a thin manila folder bearing the unmistakable blue logo of the commercial lender. A heavy silver pen lay perfectly parallel to the cardboard edge. Elaine had promised nobody would ask me to sign anything. But looking at that carefully placed folder, the truth became entirely clear. The invitation was not an olive branch or a plea for reconciliation. They had brought me here to trap me, fully prepared to force my signature right there in front of the wedding guests. The rain had turned into a steady, freezing downpour by the time I slid behind the steering wheel of my sedan. The leather seat felt cold against my damp coat, and the heavy drops hammered against the metal roof in a deafening rhythm. My phone was pressed hard against my ear. Daniel Mercer's breathing sounded jagged through the speaker, competing with the noise of the storm. He had just realized the massive corporate expansion loan required a personal guarantee, placing his own financial assets directly on the chopping block to secure the Blake family debt. He did not ask me for legal advice, nor did he ask for sympathy. The Army Reserve captain simply needed a tactical confirmation before walking back into the line of fire. "Did you expressly forbid the company from using that report before it was submitted, Colonel?" Daniel asked. His voice carried that familiar, flat tone he used right before executing a hard order. I watched a single drop of water trace a slow path down the driver's side window, cutting through the condensation. I denied the signature in writing weeks before the bank received the file. A long pause stretched across the line. "Who uploaded it?" he asked. "I do not guess about evidence, Captain," I replied. "Call your own attorney." Daniel hung up the phone. I kept the engine off and rolled my window down 2 inches, letting the damp Carolina air fill the cabin. The heavy side doors of the renovated mill stood propped open across the gravel lot, allowing sound to carry straight through the rain. My brother-in-arms had marched directly back into the bridal suite. His raised voice echoed across the asphalt, sharp and unyielding as he demanded answers from the woman in the white dress. He asked Jenna 3 questions in rapid succession. Did you have a sister? Did you know she denied the signature? Did you upload the document anyway? My sister's voice pitched high, frantic and shrill. She deflected the interrogation instantly, loudly blaming our father for the entire financial arrangement. The response from the groom was a heavy, devastating silence. Daniel told her there would be no ceremony today, nor would he sign any banking documents until an independent lawyer verified every single page of Blake infrastructure accounting. I started my engine, shifted into drive, and pulled out of the parking lot. I did not wait to watch the wedding guests disperse, and I felt absolutely no desire to see my sister collapse in her ruined dress. The drive back to my townhouse took nearly 40 minutes. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the storm, slapping back and forth across the glass. My phone buzzed continuously in the cup holder, illuminating the dark interior with missed call notifications. Most were from confused relatives, but Elaine left a rambling, furious voicemail. I connected the device to the car speakers, letting my mother's voice fill the quiet space. "You humiliated her in front of everyone," Elaine wept, the audio crackling with static. She claimed I had orchestrated the entire afternoon just to punish them for being successful. Then, her grief shifted into that familiar, venomous anger. "Your father needed that signature. You had already taken everything else from him, and you could not give us this one little thing." I pressed the save button on the dashboard console. The recording was not a perfectly scripted confession, but it firmly established that my mother knew exactly why my name was required for the loan. I forwarded the audio file directly to Naomi Price before turning onto my quiet street. My townhouse sat dark and still at the end of a wooded cul-de-sac. I locked the deadbolt, changed out of my damp navy dress, and poured a glass of cold water in the kitchen. Just past 9 o'clock. The external security chime echoed through the hallway. I checked the digital monitor mounted next to the alarm panel. Jenna and Martin stood on my front porch, illuminated by the harsh glare of the motion sensor floodlight. My sister had changed out of her bridal gown into a wrinkled trench coat, her perfect makeup ruined by hours of crying. Martin stood rigidly behind her, his face dark with suppressed fury. They did not ring the bell a second time. My father simply pounded his heavy fist against the solid wood, demanding I open the door and fix the massive misunderstanding I had caused. I pressed the intercom button, keeping my voice completely neutral. Step off the porch. All communication goes through my attorney. Jenna lunged toward the speaker grill. "You ruined my life," she screamed, her voice distorting through the small microphone. Tears streaked down her pale cheeks as the bride demanded I sign a retraction immediately. She insisted that Daniel would come back if I just signed the acknowledgement paper and told the bank it was a simple clerical error. I took my finger off the button and stepped away from the panel. The doorbell camera silently recorded every threat, every demand for a fraudulent signature, and every frantic attempt to bully a witness. They stayed on the porch for 10 minutes before Martin finally grabbed Jenna by the arm and dragged her back to his luxury sedan. I watched their taillights fade down the street, poured the rest of my water down the sink, and went to bed. By Tuesday morning, the fallout began to crystallize into a formal legal structure. Daniel sent a brief, encrypted text message while I was reviewing bridge schematics at the military base. He confirmed he had officially hired independent counsel and withdrawn all financial backing from the Blake Infrastructure Expansion Project. He also offered to provide a sworn affidavit detailing exactly what Jenna had said during the aborted wedding reception. I thanked him for his integrity and provided the contact information for Naomi. I explicitly declined to meet him for coffee or discuss the matter in private. Blurring the lines between a commercial fraud investigation and a personal relationship would only give Martin ammunition to claim I had seduced the groom to sabotage the company. Daniel understood the boundary immediately, and our communication ended there. The commercial lender froze the underwriting process entirely that same afternoon. Naomi informed me that the bank counsel had issued a sweeping preservation order to the company, requiring a total lockdown of all corporate data. Minority stakeholders panicked, demanding an outside forensic firm step in to secure the network. 3 excruciating weeks dragged by. I focused entirely on my engineering duties, spending my days inspecting reinforced concrete pillars, and my evenings reading quietly in my living room. The waiting was the hardest part of the discipline, knowing that professional investigators were slowly tearing my family's digital history apart. On the first Monday of May, I was sitting in my office when my private cell phone vibrated across the metal desk. Naomi Price rarely called during business hours unless the tectonic plates had finally shifted. I answered on the first ring. The independent forensic preservation team just released their preliminary findings to the lender counsel, my attorney said. Her voice sounded tight, vibrating with a suppressed electric energy. The bank lawyers had to disclose it to us due to the legal hold. I picked up a pen, rolling the smooth plastic between my fingers. Did they find the upload log? They found much more than that, Naomi replied. She explained that someone inside the executive office had panicked the morning after the wedding. An administrator account had attempted to permanently delete a restricted archive folder labeled Old Blake Safety. The deletion command had triggered an automated security protocol because the bank had already locked the system architecture. The forensic team easily bypassed the error and recovered the entire directory. Jenna did not just try to hide the new bank submission, my attorney continued, the words dropping like heavy stones into a calm pond. The recovered folder contained the original digital workspace used to alter the Crane report 11 years ago. The metadata on the forged document points directly to a specific workstation. The plastic pen snapped sharply in my hand, sending a jagged piece of blue plastic skittering across the desk. "Whose computer?" I asked. Naomi took a slow breath. The file was created 11 years ago on a terminal assigned exclusively to Jenna Blake. The revelation about the hidden metadata forced the commercial lender into immediate, aggressive action. Bank underwriters do not tolerate digital tampering, especially when multi-million-dollar expansion loans hang in the balance. By the middle of May, the minority stakeholders of Blake Infrastructure launched a full corporate revolt. They demanded an independent forensic firm take total operational control of the company's servers. Martin fought the motion violently. He attempted to hire a friendly local attorney to conduct a private internal review, shouting down the board members in a frantic morning meeting. The stakeholders overruled the founder. My father lost his unchecked power in a single afternoon. Following standard compliance protocols, Jenna was formally suspended from her role as Chief Financial Officer. Her corporate access cards were deactivated immediately, and security escorted her out of the glass building she had planned to inherit. The sudden presence of cold, detached forensic accountants walking through the corporate corridors sent shockwaves through the administrative staff. Naomi requested my physical evidence to cross-reference with the independent investigation. I drove to the secure bank vault, retrieved the blue file from the steel box, and paid a clerk to make high-resolution color scans. The original documents remained safely locked behind the heavy vault door. I handed a sealed envelope to my attorney, providing the reviewers with the final puzzle pieces they desperately needed. The outside forensic firm hired a certified document examiner to analyze the paperwork. The expert placed the forged clearance report from the insurance archives directly beside my authentic draft cover sheet. The two signatures were a perfect, impossible match. Every microscopic fluctuation in the blue ink lined up exactly, right down to a tiny hesitation mark on the final curve of my last name. Furthermore, the examiner found a phantom staple puncture on the forged document that perfectly mirrored the original draft. A person cannot sign their name identically twice, nor do they replicate old staple holes with such absolute precision. The footer and version codes on the 2 pages completely mismatched. The forensic conclusion left no room for debate. The signature page had been physically lifted from my mundane vendor receipt and grafted directly onto the fraudulent safety clearance. We had the mechanical proof of forgery, but connecting that fake document to the actual disaster required a solid timeline. Naomi presented the yellow carbon copy of Stop Work Directive 17C, the fragile paper Evan Pike had pulled from his father's dusty garage box. She laid it next to the frantic email I had sent to the corporate lawyers 11 years ago. The serial number for the crane matched perfectly across both records. The archive department of the outside law firm confirmed my email had been logged into their server hours before the metal beam fell. During the civil discovery process, Ruth Delgado provided a sworn statement that cemented the truth. Before Miguel left for his final shift on that freezing morning, he had called his wife. He explicitly mentioned that a female engineer had grounded the massive machine, but the company owner had ordered the crew to start lifting anyway. The independent review board finally possessed an unbroken chain of custody, proving the site was officially closed by my authority before the fatal accident occurred. The forensic investigators dug deep into the recovered server drives, mapping out the entire digital history of the file labeled Clearance Final Clean. Their findings confirmed Naomi's initial phone call. The document was born 11 years ago on a computer assigned exclusively to the young office administrator. The scanning software history logged a manual page insertion occurring mere hours after I had packed my bags and walked out of the family home. My sister had watched me sign the cover sheet, waited until I left the room, and immediately took the paper to the copy machine. A decade-old forgery was difficult to prosecute on its own, but the family had generously provided a brand new crime. The Lender Council finally released a certified access report to the Independent Review Board, detailing the exact portal traffic from late March. The access log showed Jenna logging in with her secure executive credentials. She uploaded the manipulated portable document format and manually clicked the electronic certification box, legally guaranteeing that the financial packet was authentic and accurate. She executed that digital signature exactly 3 weeks after Naomi delivered our formal denial letter. My sister had opened the attorney warning from her corporate email account, read the clear legal boundary, and then deliberately submitted the fraudulent paperwork anyway. She assumed I would never find out. The final, devastating piece of the puzzle emerged from a routine phone backup. When security escorted Jenna from the building, she had been forced to leave her corporate smartphone sitting on her desk. The forensic experts retrieved a chain of deleted text messages exchanged between the chief financial officer and the chief executive officer on the morning of the bank submission. Naomi read the transcript aloud in her office on a humid Thursday afternoon. I sat across the mahogany table, listening to the exact words that destroyed my family. Corinne denied the signature again, Jenna had texted. Use the Blake copy, Martin responded less than 2 minutes later. She has stayed quiet for 11 years. The bank only needs a signed report, Jenna typed back. Once the money clears, it will not matter. Naomi placed the printed transcript flat on the desk, folding her hands over the paper. Her expression was perfectly calm, but a sharp edge of triumph carried in her voice. For the first time, we have knowledge, action, and intent, the attorney said. They did not make a clerical error. They made a calculated choice to steal your name, and they documented their own conspiracy in writing. I looked down at the black ink on the white paper. That was the reality of my family. My father had traded my reputation to protect a broken machine, and my sister had gladly helped him do it just to secure her inheritance. They did not love each other. They simply shared a mutual liability, bound together by a desperate need to keep the corporate facade intact. The legal trap was finally complete. The evidence was packaged, verified, and ready to be handed over to the appropriate authorities. I thought the battle was shifting into a quiet, orderly courtroom. We completely underestimated the woman who raised me. On Friday morning, my phone began vibrating continuously against the kitchen counter. I was wiping down the granite surface, finishing a cup of black coffee before heading to the base for a morning briefing. I ignored the first 3 unknown numbers, assuming they were confused relatives calling about the canceled wedding. Then my closest neighborhood friend sent a text message with an internet link attached. "Call me right now," the message read. I dried my hands on a towel and tapped the screen, opening the link to the local business journal. The headline of the regional newspaper was printed in bold, aggressive black type across the bright screen. Decorated Army Colonel accused of blackmailing family business on sister wedding day. I leaned against the counter, reading the opening paragraph, while the blood pounded a slow, heavy rhythm in my ears. The article painted a tragic picture of an elderly, hard-working founder being extorted by a jealous, estranged daughter. The text claimed I had used military intimidation tactics to hold a vital community construction project hostage, demanding millions of dollars to drop a baseless legal claim. The reporter cited a single, named source for the explosive allegations. Elaine Blake had decided to enter the war, and she was coming directly for my career. The coffee cup sitting on the granite counter felt heavy and completely useless. My cell phone vibrated continuously, inching toward the edge of the stone surface with every incoming call. The digital screen illuminated a steady stream of unfamiliar numbers and names from my childhood I had not spoken to in 11 years. My mother had not just spoken to a local reporter to plant a damaging story. Elaine had launched a systematic social bombardment, sending physical letters to the extended family, her wealthy charity board, and the regional church directory. The neatly typed pages claimed I had showed up at my sister's wedding wearing my military rank like a weapon, demanding a massive cash payout to keep a fabricated secret. I did not answer the ringing phone, because answering meant arguing, and arguing meant descending into the chaotic emotional pit my mother had carefully dug. Instead, I silenced the device, packed my uniform into a garment bag, and drove straight to the military base. The fluorescent lights in the Base Ethics Council office hummed with a low, steady frequency. The small room smelled of floor wax and stale printer paper. A senior military attorney reviewed the printed article, his expression completely neutral. I sat across from him, keeping my spine perfectly straight. I presented my complete communication logs, a sworn statement from Naomi, and the timeline of my private civil dispute. The documentation proved unequivocally that I had never utilized military personnel, government letterhead, or my rank in any dealings with Blake infrastructure. My commanding officer had already approved a temporary reassignment, keeping me away from regional contracting duties that might intersect with my father's commercial network. The ethics officer closed my file and nodded. The command structure recognized the situation for exactly what it was: a desperate civilian smear campaign attempting to leverage my uniform to force a retreat. The Army would not issue a glowing press release to defend my honor, but my career remained completely secure. I walked out of the administrative building feeling a profound sense of relief. My parents could poison the country club gossip pool, but they could not touch the life I had built. While I secured my professional perimeter, Jenna was busy building a digital fortress of victimhood. My younger sister flooded her social media channels with softly lit photographs and tragic paragraphs. She spun a beautiful, melancholic narrative about a jealous older sibling who had always resented her for staying home to care for our aging parents. Jenna completely omitted any mention of the commercial lender, the forensic audit, or the forged signature. She wanted her followers to believe my appearance at the wedding was simply a bitter attempt to steal her groom. That specific narrative died a very sudden public death 48 hours later. Daniel Mercer did not engage in internet drama, nor did he allow his reputation to become collateral damage in a family war. The reserve captain released a single, devastatingly precise public statement through his private attorney. The press release clarified that the wedding had been permanently canceled because material financial information was withheld from the groom prior to the ceremony. He stated that the decision had absolutely nothing to do with Colonel Hayes. The cold, corporate phrasing instantly killed the romance rumor, leaving Jenna looking not like a heartbroken bride, but like a severe financial liability. Naomi Price matched that calculated restraint perfectly. Later that week, I sat in her downtown office, watching the city traffic crawl through the summer heat. My attorney released our own public statement. It contained exactly 3 verifiable facts. The release confirmed I had never signed the equipment clearance report, that I had formally denied the signature in writing before the bank received the file, and that I was not seeking any ownership stake in Blake Infrastructure. I wanted to release the text messages. A dark, angry part of my chest burned to publish the exact words my father and sister had exchanged, proving their guilt to the entire world. Naomi strongly advised against it, warning that dumping evidence into the court of public opinion would only jeopardize the ongoing federal investigation. We had the high ground, and holding the smoking gun in reserve made the family significantly more nervous than firing it prematurely. We let them sweat. The pressure finally broke them in late August. A thick courier envelope arrived at Naomi's office on a quiet Friday afternoon. The package contained a formal settlement offer drafted by the elite defense attorneys representing Martin Blake. Naomi read the terms aloud while I stared at the rain streaking the office window. The document offered me $750,000 in cash, full payment of my legal fees, and a private letter of apology. In exchange, I had to sign a strict confidentiality agreement and release a public statement classifying the entire dispute as a mutual clerical misunderstanding. The money was a staggering amount, but the true cost of the settlement was buried deep in the 4th paragraph. Naomi paused. The draft explicitly stipulated that the chief financial officer had acted entirely independently, without the knowledge or authorization of the chief executive officer. A heavy, suffocating silence filled the room. The paper in Naomi's hands was not just a peace offering, it was an execution order. Martin was preparing to sacrifice his golden child to the federal authorities to save his own skin. He wanted me to take $750,000 to legally validate the lie that Jenna had orchestrated the massive bank fraud entirely on her own. The sheer cruelty of the maneuver took my breath away. For 11 years, Jenna had believed she was the chosen daughter, the loyal heir who had earned our father's love by helping him forge my name. Now, the moment the corporate ship began taking on water, Martin was throwing her directly into the propellers. "Reject the offer," I told Naomi. my voice barely above a whisper. "I will not sign anything that covers up the truth. Tell them I want a public retraction from Elaine, and I want Miguel Delgado's official safety record corrected." I left the attorney office feeling completely hollow. The realization that my father viewed both of his daughters strictly as disposable assets was not a victory. It was just a tragedy that had taken a decade to fully articulate. The absolute confirmation of their moral bankruptcy arrived that same evening. I was sitting on my living room sofa watching the evening news without truly seeing the screen. My phone chimed with a new voicemail alert. It was Elaine. I pressed play, letting the audio echo through the quiet townhouse. My mother sounded completely unhinged, her voice thick with panic and cheap wine. She had just learned about my rejection of the massive settlement offer, and her carefully constructed social mask had entirely vanished. "You are going to destroy him," Elaine sobbed into the receiver. "Your father is going to lose everything because you refuse to give him one simple signature. You are so incredibly selfish, Corinne. I had to tell the family you caused that crane accident. I had to protect his reputation. I knew you issued that stop work order, but you abandoned us anyway." The voicemail clicked and ended. I sat entirely still in the fading evening light, the air in my lungs turning to ice. My mother knew. The woman who raised me had always known the truth. Elaine knew I had tried to save Miguel Delgado. She knew Martin had overridden my safety directive, and she had spent 11 years actively telling our relatives that I was the coward who caused a fatal disaster. She had traded my honor for her country club membership without a single moment of hesitation. I saved the audio file to the secure server, my hands steady and completely cold. The family had officially fired their last desperate shots, burning their own house down just to keep the smoke in my eyes. Early the next morning, my phone rang again. Naomi Price rarely called on a Saturday unless the foundation of a case had fundamentally shifted. I answered immediately, bracing myself for another legal maneuver from the corporate defense team. "The federal prosecutor just notified us," Naomi said, her voice dropping into a low, serious register. "Martin Blake formally rejected his own settlement strategy late last night. He just signed an agreement to provide full state testimony against his daughter in exchange for criminal consideration." I stared out the kitchen window at the empty street. The war against the family was officially over. The war between a father and his golden child had just begun. The boardroom of Blake Infrastructure looked like a tomb during the emergency meeting in mid-September. The air felt thick, heavy with the stench of stale coffee and the palpable dread of the senior managers seated around the mahogany table. I did not attend in person, but Naomi provided me with a detailed transcript and a recording of the proceedings. Minority stakeholders and lender representatives occupied every chair, their faces set in hard, unforgiving lines. Martin Blake sat at the head of the table, though his hands shook slightly as he gripped the armrests of his leather chair. He had been stripped of his signing authority weeks ago, his corporate access codes revoked, and he now looked like a ghost haunting his own legacy. Jenna was not present. She had been placed on indefinite administrative leave, her professional reputation dissolving under the intense heat of the forensic investigation. The employees staring at the screen appeared utterly shell-shocked, watching their leader crumble while the company that had defined their careers hovered on the brink of total collapse. I felt a sharp, hollow pang of sympathy for the workers who had committed no crime beyond needing a paycheck, but I refused to provide the life raft my father desperately sought. My integrity was not a commodity available for purchase, and I would never sign a false acknowledgement to stabilize his sinking ship. 4 days after the board meeting, I received an unexpected request through Naomi. Jenna wanted to meet me in person, without the lawyers present. The request struck me as a desperate gamble, a final attempt to salvage her crumbling reality. We met in a quiet, anonymous cafe, located halfway between the base and the city center. Jenna sat in a corner booth, her appearance entirely stripped of the designer clothes and perfect styling I remembered from the wedding. She looked exhausted, her skin sallow and her eyes rimmed with the deep purple bruising of chronic sleep deprivation. She did not open with an apology or a plea for mercy. She simply stared at her lukewarm tea, claiming she was merely a naive 22-year-old girl when our father first forced her to handle the forged safety files. I waited for her to finish the rehearsed narrative. When the silence finally settled over the table, I leaned forward, my voice low and steady. "You were 22 when the accident happened, Jenna," I said. "But you were the chief financial officer when you uploaded that fraudulent paperwork to the bank last spring. You were an adult who knew exactly what you were doing." She did not answer. She just gripped her ceramic mug until her knuckles turned ivory white. "It was supposed to be mine after Dad retired," she whispered, the raw confession hanging in the air. That was all she had ever wanted. She had sacrificed her own integrity for a crown that was already rusting away. My father's formal deposition took place 2 weeks later in a cramped downtown legal suite. I arrived early, sitting quietly in the back, while a court reporter meticulously recorded every syllable. Martin looked diminished, his expensive silk tie hanging slightly askew. Under the intense pressure of the federal inquiry, his arrogant facade finally shattered. He initially insisted that Jenna managed the scanning software and that he had assumed the records were legitimate, but Naomi dismantled that defense within 20 minutes. She played the recorded text messages, reading his own words back to him in a cold, clinical tone. He crumbled, immediately shifting his strategy to save his personal assets. He told the attorneys he was only trying to protect the payroll, claiming his actions were born of corporate necessity rather than malicious intent. When the lawyer asked if he had considered Miguel Delgado's family while trying to protect the payroll, my father simply looked at his shaking hands. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. Jenna's deposition followed on the next day. The sight of my sister, sitting in that chair, stripped of her professional authority and facing the very real possibility of prison, provided no sense of satisfaction. She tried to maintain a thin veneer of innocence, claiming she had genuinely expected me to authorize the forged documents after the fact. The document examiner obliterated that defense with a single chart showing the timestamps, proving she had finalized the file hours after Naomi had sent the formal cease and desist notice. She stared at the projection screen, finally looking over at Martin, who refused to meet her gaze. My sister realized in that moment that she had been completely abandoned. My father had provided the forensic team with every workstation log and email backup in his possession, effectively throwing his daughter directly to the federal authorities to secure his own plea deal. While the lawyers finished their work, the independent management team approached me with a final, staggering proposal. They wanted me to accept a seat on the corporate advisory board or take an equity option to purchase the company at a drastically reduced price. The firm believed my return would restore market confidence and protect the brand reputation. I stared at the contract, feeling the weight of the paper in my hands. The prospect of walking back into that glass office, finally holding the power they had denied me for over a decade, felt incredibly tempting. I could rewrite the safety protocols, ensure Miguel Delgado's family received every cent owed to them, and rebuild the firm on a foundation of actual integrity. I read through the proposed terms 3 times, taking my time to process the consequences. If I accepted the position, I would forever remain tied to the Blake family legacy. My life would become a constant struggle against the ghosts of their choices. I would never be free of their names, their reputation, or their lingering shame. I looked at the lead independent manager and firmly declined the offer. I agreed to serve as a temporary safety consultant for a strictly defined, short-term project, but I insisted on no equity, no voting rights, and absolutely no family name printed on the corporate stationery. The final hammer fell in late November when the federal subpoenas reached their destination. The forensic firm seized the insurance records, phone backups, and the remaining physical files from the central office. There was no theatrical arrest at the wedding, No handcuffs in the boardroom, and no dramatic police raid at the townhouse. The process was slow, methodical, and completely devastating. Jenna was escorted out of the building for the final time, carrying a single cardboard box containing her personal desk belongings while the remaining employees watched from their cubicles. I did not go to see it, but Naomi described the scene in detail. They removed the silver plaque from the door of the executive office. Jenna Blake, chief financial officer, had officially ceased to exist within the corporate walls. I spent the final week of November reviewing the evidence package for the prosecutor, ensuring every timestamp and digital signature was perfectly documented. My sister had successfully convinced herself that she was the victim, that she was merely a dutiful daughter who had been corrupted by her environment. She could not accept the simple, ugly truth that she had made her own choices. I did not blame the environment, and I did not blame our father for her actions. We are the sum of our decisions, and she had decided to build her entire life upon a foundation of stolen time and shattered bones. The evening before the final sentencing files were turned over to the court, I sat in my quiet living room, watching the sun dip behind the trees in the backyard. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. Jenna had sent a final text message from her private account, the first time she had reached out since the cafe meeting. "If I take the plea deal, will he lose the company?" she asked. I did not type a response. I did not offer her a moral lesson or try to comfort her. I simply blocked the number, set the phone back on the table, and walked into the backyard. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the crisp, clean air of a life I had built entirely on my own. The war was coming to its natural, inevitable conclusion. My father would survive the legal fire, but he would lose the only thing he had ever truly loved. And my sister would spend the next 2 years learning that blood did not exempt her from the consequences of her own actions. The blue file in the safe could finally be closed. I had survived them. I had outlasted their lies, and I had successfully navigated the wreckage they created without becoming a mirror of their cruelty. The sun set behind the horizon, leaving the yard in soft, gathering shadows, and for the first time in 11 years, the silence in my house felt like a genuine victory. The legal system moved with a deliberate, grinding pace that felt entirely disconnected from the raw pain of the last year. By January of 2026, Jenna finally entered her formal plea. She accepted full responsibility for the deliberate manipulation of the safety reports, the electronic certification fraud, and the frantic attempts to delete the digital trail. The sentencing hearing took place in a sterile courtroom downtown, the air inside smelling of old dust and floor wax. The judge imposed a sentence of 24 months in a federal facility, followed by a long period of supervised release, significant financial restitution, and a permanent lifetime ban from holding any position involving corporate financial oversight. I sat in the back row, listening to the legal proceedings while the rest of the world moved on outside the tall windows. Jenna stood before the bench in a plain gray jumpsuit, her shoulders slumped beneath the weight of her reality. She did not look back at me, and I did not try to catch her eye. Martin sat in the front row, his posture rigid and his hands gripped tightly over the head of his silver cane. He had already settled his own civil liability, agreeing to substantial fines, house arrest, and a lifetime ban from corporate management in exchange for his cooperation. The personal guarantee that once held his lake house and private art collection had been called in, forcing him to liquidate the vast majority of his personal wealth to satisfy the court requirements. The company itself did not survive the fire. A regional industrial group purchased the remains of Blake Infrastructure, keeping the existing labor force, but purging every level of the original management hierarchy. I watched from across the street as a crane hoisted the new company sign into place, the bland, anonymous name replacing the legacy my father had spent his entire life building. It felt like watching a fever finally break. Elaine Blake received the harshest social sentence of all. As part of the civil settlement agreement, My mother had to sign a formal written retraction, an admission that I had indeed issued the stop work directive and never signed the final clearance report. The document was mailed directly to the local church directory, the charity board she had sat on for decades, and the extended family members who had spent years listening to her manufactured stories. The charity boards demanded her immediate resignation, and the sudden loss of her social status seemed to vanish her entire identity. She lost the only thing she had ever truly valued, her reputation as a perfect mother and a pillar of the community, and she had to live the rest of her life in the quiet, isolated shadow of her own choices. The most profound shift occurred in the settlement of Miguel Delgado's legacy. The insurance company and the corporate legal team finally issued a formal correction to the official record, striking the operator error finding and acknowledging the mechanical failure as the true cause of the collapse. Ruth Delgado received a final settlement payment, providing her with the financial security my father had denied her for over a decade, but the money felt secondary to the restoration of her husband's dignity. I sat with Ruth in a quiet, sunlit room when the safety training fund in Miguel's name was officially established. I did not stand in the center of the room to receive any credit, and I did not seek a photograph. I just sat beside her and let the silence heal the jagged edges of the past. The final sentencing phase for Jenna ended on a Tuesday afternoon. As the bailiffs moved to lead her out of the courtroom, my sister paused and looked directly at me. The hatred in her gaze had burned down into a dull, exhausted coal. "You destroyed our family," she whispered, her voice cracking in the quiet hall. I stood up, adjusting the collar of my blazer, and looked at her with a clarity that had taken 11 years to sharpen. "No," I replied, my voice steady and completely devoid of malice. "I stopped letting you use my name to hold it together." She was led away, her movements slow and measured, while Martin remained slumped in the front row. My father did not stand up. He did not cry out, and he certainly did not try to stop the officers. He looked down at the pile of legal papers on his lap, a broken man who had successfully betrayed everyone he ever claimed to love. He had sacrificed his daughter, his wealth, and his legacy just to avoid a few years in a prison cell, and the total emptiness of that bargain seemed to crush him right there in his seat. Before the proceedings adjourned, Martin made one last desperate attempt to reach out. He stood up with the help of his cane and approached me near the exit, his eyes watery and his breathing heavy. He asked if I would consider using my professional reputation to convince the new buyers to keep the Blake name on the renovated safety center, claiming that without his name on the building, his entire life would have no meaning. I looked at the man who had ordered me to sign a fraudulent document over a dead man's body, the man who had called me a disgrace for choosing integrity over his profit. "You used my name when it was useful," I said, my tone remaining polite but utterly detached. "Now you can learn to live without yours." He did not argue. He just lowered his head and walked out into the bright, indifferent sunlight of the parking lot. The buyer had already confirmed that the signage would be replaced before the end of the week, and the new facility would be named in honor of the man who died because Martin Blake refused to wait for a replacement part. The final act of the legal drama ended with a heavy, satisfying thud. The evidence package was returned to the archives, the formal retractions were distributed, and the safety records were finally, correctly amended. The family had not been destroyed by me, nor had they been undone by the prosecutor. They had simply been exposed for what they truly were. As I walked out of the courthouse and into the crisp, cool air of late spring, I felt a strange, light sensation in my chest. The weight that I had carried for over a decade had simply evaporated. I checked my watch, seeing that I still had enough time to catch the afternoon train back home. My life was waiting for me, filled with my chosen family and the quiet, honest work of engineering that had sustained me through the exile. I did not look back at the courthouse, and I did not look for my father's car in the lot. I just kept walking, moving toward the future I had purchased for myself, one honest choice at a time. The battle was over. The wreckage had been cleared, and I was finally, truly free. The invitation to join the advisory board sat on my desk for 3 full days, the heavy cream cardstock contrasting sharply against my worn wooden surface. The independent buyers behind the acquisition of Blake Infrastructure were serious. They offered a lucrative retainer, complete creative control over the new safety protocols, and the power to design the entire engineering oversight system for the regional division. It was the exact validation I had craved for 11 years, a formal recognition that I had been the competent, visionary professional all along. I spent 3 long evenings analyzing the contract, meticulously reviewing every liability clause and operational mandate, exactly as I would for any commercial project. I realized then that I wanted the industry standards improved, and I certainly wanted the workers protected, but I had absolutely no desire to return to the heart of the family legacy. I did not want to attend board meetings in that glass building. I did not want to negotiate with regional contractors who still whispered about the Blake family name, and I certainly did not want to tether my daily existence to the ghosts of my past. I drafted a professional counterproposal, declining the permanent seat on the advisory board. Instead, I offered a limited-term consulting contract focused entirely on the safety architecture. No equity, no voting power, and no personal branding on the corporate stationery. The buyers accepted my terms within the hour, content to have my stamp of approval on their new safety initiatives without demanding my full-time allegiance. The remaining money from my legal settlement provided a quiet, firm foundation for my future. I instructed Naomi to pay off the final balance of my townhouse mortgage, finally removing the 30-year anchor from my ledger. I padded my retirement account, ensuring that I would never again depend on a corporate entity for my basic survival. I took a portion of the settlement and established a small permanent scholarship fund for the children of industrial construction workers. The donation remained completely anonymous, handled through a local university trust. I did not need the vanity of a name on a building to feel that the scale of justice had finally tilted back toward the center. One Tuesday in early June, Ruth Delgado invited me to the site of the former Blake facility. We stood on the sidewalk across the street as a crane team slowly lowered the old, jagged Blake Infrastructure sign into the back of a flatbed truck. Martin remained parked in his luxury sedan a block away, watching the removal from behind tinted windows, entirely powerless to stop the inevitable change. The new company sign, a clean, neutral logo representing the regional buyer, was hoisted into place, marking the official end of an era. The renovation work on the interior of the safety center was finally finished, and the new Miguel Delgado Training Center was ready for the inaugural class of site supervisors. I stood with Ruth, watching the afternoon light hit the fresh lettering, and felt a quiet, profound sense of closure. The past was finally where it belonged, locked behind us in the rearview mirror. My mother stopped by the townhouse later that week, appearing for the first time without the protective armor of my father or Jenna. She stood on my porch, looking significantly smaller than she had in my memory, wearing a simple beige cardigan and clutching her handbag with white-knuckled tension. She asked for a chance to explain, pleading for me to acknowledge her as my mother. I looked at the woman who had helped erase my life to protect a social reputation and felt no burning anger, only a strange, detached pity. "You are the woman who gave birth to me," I said, my voice soft but entirely resolute. "But you spent 11 years choosing a side, and you built that wall brick by brick. A relationship is built on truth and consistent action, not biology." Elaine asked if there was any path toward redemption, any chance for a fresh start. I did not tell her never, because that felt like another absolute decree, but I set the conditions that I knew she would never fulfill. She needed to complete long-term professional therapy, stop calling me without advance notice, never mention my sister's situation again, and never suggest that I should retract the evidence I provided to the federal investigators. Elaine stood there on the porch, her face crumbling as she realized that the price of my trust was the total abandonment of her old, manipulative habits. She could not accept those terms. I closed the door, locking the deadbolt with a soft, final click, and heard her walk slowly back down the steps toward her car. I never checked to see if she left the porch, because I already knew the answer. I finally pulled the blue file from the steel safe in my home office. The contents had served their purpose as a survival kit, a collection of anchors that kept me grounded when the family tried to drift me out to sea. I did not burn the papers, and I certainly did not throw them into the trash. I gathered the original documents and organized them into a permanent legal archive folder, keeping a single, thin copy for my own records. Tucked into the very back was the certified mail receipt for the $50,000 cashier check I had returned so long ago. Running my thumb over the date stamp, I realized the file had never really been about proving them wrong. It had been about proving, to myself, that I was capable of choosing my own path. My work in the Corps of Engineers continued to expand, demanding more of my focus and energy as the new year rolled into summer. I returned to the unit, spending my days drafting bridge restoration plans and preparing the next briefing for the infrastructure recovery teams. The work was demanding, messy, and infinitely rewarding because the success depended entirely on the quality of my engineering and the strength of my leadership. Daniel Mercer sent a brief, formal note of thanks to my office address, acknowledging the integrity I had shown during the legal dispute. He had successfully transitioned into a private sector risk management firm, finally walking away from the influence of the Blake family connections. We did not strike up a friendship, and I did not invite him to dinner. I simply filed the note in my desk, appreciating the mutual respect of two professionals who had survived a chaotic, dishonest environment and chose to move forward as independent actors. I received a final, framed photograph from Ruth Delgado in the mail, showing the newly finished training center with a ribbon draped across the entrance. I hung the picture in my office, a reminder that even the most stubborn, entrenched systems can be broken down if one person refuses to remain silent. My chosen family gathered for dinner at the townhouse one Saturday evening in July, the house filled with the sound of genuine laughter, clinking silverware, and the scent of rosemary roasted potatoes wafting from the oven. I sat at the head of the table, looking around at the people who had stood by me when I had nothing but a blue folder and a rented apartment. I reached down, pulling the brass key from my pocket and setting it on the table. It was the physical proof of a life I had purchased with my own labor, a threshold no family member had ever been allowed to cross without my express invitation. I looked at the people I loved, realizing that the absence of my family was not a hole in my life, but rather a space where real, honest human connection had been allowed to flourish. For 11 years, they told everyone I had abandoned the Blake name, weaving a story of a bitter, runaway daughter who could not handle the pressure of the business. The truth was far simpler. I had survived them long enough to choose a name that belonged entirely to me. The company no longer carried their name, and my life no longer carried their shame. I took a deep breath, raised my glass, and let the conversation wash over me, completely at peace in a world I had built from the ground up. You have walked the long, winding road of this story alongside Corinne, and now, as the final chapter closes, it is time to turn the mirror toward your own life. Perhaps you have spent years silently carrying the weight of a family secret, or maybe you have found yourself playing a role that was written for you by someone else long ago. The most important lesson to take away from Corinne's journey is that your name, your reputation, and your integrity are not communal assets to be traded away by those who lack the courage to stand by the truth. When you choose to protect your own dignity, you are not being selfish. You are setting a necessary boundary that allows the real you to survive. You must recognize that sacrifice is only virtuous when it serves to protect the innocent or defend the truth. Because sacrificing your well-being simply to shield those who refuse to take accountability is not love. It is enabling their destruction. If you have been living in the shadow of a legacy that no longer fits your values, remember that you possess the absolute power to start building a fortress of your own, one honest choice and one documented fact at a time. This process is never easy, and it will often feel lonely when the people you trusted most turn into the people who challenge your survival. But the quiet peace of owning your own life is worth every single bridge you have to burn along the way. Your worth is not determined by the approval of the family you were born into, nor is it defined by the narrative they have carefully constructed to keep you compliant. Your life is yours to name, yours to build, and yours to define by the strength of your own character. You do not need to seek permission to walk away from a toxic dynamic, and you do not owe anyone an apology for refusing to carry the burden of their shame. When you finally release the need for their validation, you discover that the space they once occupied is not a void, but a foundation. You can use that foundation to plant your own garden, nurture your own chosen relationships, and build a sense of self that remains unshakable regardless of external storms. True strength is not found in how much you can endure for the sake of appearances, but in how clearly you can see the truth and how firmly you can stand upon it when the world demands your silence. The story you have heard is about the high cost of silence, but it is also a testament to the fact that you can survive the worst things done to you and still emerge with your soul intact. You have the right to close the folders, lock the safes, and walk away from the wreckage of stories that were never yours to write. Your history is not a life sentence. It is simply the background for the person you are choosing to become today. Take a moment to look at the boundaries in your own life and ask yourself, what part of your own identity are you still giving away to keep the peace for someone else? Have you ever felt that you had to shrink your own truth just to satisfy the expectations of people who would never be brave enough to stand in your shoes? What is one small, honest step you can take today to reclaim a piece of the life you have been waiting to build? Does the silence you keep serve your healing, or is it merely protecting the people who hurt you? Is there a voice you have been suppressing, a truth you have been hiding, or a door you have been afraid to lock because you fear the sound of it clicking shut? Share your thoughts, because your voice is the most powerful tool you have to dismantle the legacies that no longer serve you.